Hi, this is Pat Johnson, your psychology instructor, and in this mini lecture we're going to talk about 3 types of responses that can be classically conditioned. As I've said before, one of the most important things to remember about classical conditioning is only involuntary responses can be classically conditioned. This is probably the area where most of my students have problems in this section of the module and lose the most points on the test is because they try to put voluntary behaviors into classical conditioning scenarios. And classical conditioning only deals with involuntary responses, those responses done by the autonomic nervous system. So let's look at the 3 types of responses that can be classically conditioned. First one is emotions. Emotions can be easily classically conditioned, and usually the one most people think of is fear. So we'll look at how fear can be classically conditioned. Then we're going to look at responses that go under the label of vegetative responses. Vegetative responses preserve the well-being of the body, and we'll look at those. Then we'll look at levels of arousal, and by levels of arousal we mean things like alertness or drowsiness. Notice all of these are involuntary. So first of all, let's look at emotions, and let's draw out a quick emotion classical conditioning scenario, and we'll use the example of fear. So let's suppose you see a dog, and dogs are neutral. You kind of like dogs. You may not feel anything about dogs, but you see a dog, and the dog bites you, and you experience fear. Now, whenever you see a dog, you experience fear. So dog would have been previously neutral. That would now be the conditioned stimulus. And the dog biting you would be an unconditioned stimulus. Fear to the dog bite would be an unconditioned response. And now just seeing a dog causes a conditioned response. We could also look at liking as an emotion that could be classically conditioned, and marketing experts do this all the time. What they will do is they will pair a neutral product with maybe an athlete or an actor that you really like. So we'll say an actor, and you like that actor. And just by pairing the product with the actor enough times, pretty soon you have a desirable feeling towards that product. So again, emotions can be easily classically conditioned. Let's go on to vegetative responses. And as we said, vegetative responses are responses that preserve the well-being of the body. And these would be things like eye blink or salivation. Heartbeat could be easily classically conditioned. The rate of breathing, that could be classically conditioned. All of these are involuntary responses. So let's take a quick look and look at an example of how an eye blink could be classically conditioned. And I've actually had my students do this, and it works really rapidly, and it shows the principles of classical conditioning really easily, and it's actually kind of fun. So let's say you take your roommate or your brother or sister or your spouse and you make a tone. Maybe you tap on a glass like that or something. You make a tone, and then using a drinking straw, you blow a puff of air in their eye. Now, if anybody gets a puff of air in their eye, they're going to be immediately going to blink. And do that enough times where you make the tone, the conditioned stimulus, pair it with the unconditioned stimulus of blowing air in their eye, and they're going to blink. And pretty soon, just that tone is going to cause them to blink. And as I said, this could be a really fun one to do with a loved one to show you how easily classical conditioning can occur. And again, remember, you want about a half a second interval between your CS and your US. Now let's look at levels of arousal. And again, by levels of arousal, we meant things like alertness or drowsiness. An example of alertness, classically conditioned, when I teach this class seated and I'm teaching the fight or flight response in the sympathetic nervous system, what I usually do is tell students to look at a particular page in the textbook, and then while they're looking at the page, I slam a book down loudly on my desk, and they immediately jump. They have an extreme level of alertness. And one semester, it was such a good pop that every time I said, look at page such and such, I had a student who jumped. So that would be an example of alertness being classically conditioned. Drowsiness, let's suppose I'm the most boring instructor in the world, and let's suppose you see my face, and then I am really boring. I drone on and on and on. So we'll say boring lecture, and you feel drowsy. Oopsie. And pretty soon, just when you see my face, you would start feeling drowsy. Notice we didn't say anything about coming to school or going to work or reading or learning to drive. All of those would be voluntary responses. Classical conditioning only deals with involuntary responses. So when I ask for an example of classical conditioning, I sometimes have students make a mistake and say something like, the cat learns to run into the kitchen at the sound of the can opener. That wouldn't be classical conditioning, because running into the kitchen at the sound of the can opener is a voluntary behavior. That's part of the somatic nervous system. So again, we have emotions, vegetative responses, and levels of arousal.